Good afternoon, everybody. As you can see on your screen, my name is Clare Wallace. I'm from Charles University, and it is a real pleasure to close this conference with two amazing Irish arts practitioners whose work has engaged directly and dynamically with the arts and civic public space between different communities, both within the arts environment, both in Ireland and abroad, as well as working across genres of different kinds of arts practice. And since this conference has been all about interfaces and dialogues, I think it's really appropriate that we finish with Lian Bell and Maeve Stone, who I think are ideally placed to tease out maybe some of these threads connecting arts practices in Ireland, representational politics or activism, and the challenges of working culture in the current moment. The keywords that came to my mind as we were preparing this were collaboration and change, resistance, resilience. And one way or another, I think these ideas will infuse and orientate what we end up talking about. Before we get going, I wanted to begin with some brief introduction, Lian and Maeve, to tell us more about their work and current situation and interests. A lot of the conference has been very focused on literary and historical scholarship, so perhaps their work is a little bit less known to you in such a close way. So I'll start with Lian Bell, who is a multidisciplinary artist, freelance arts manager and designer for performance. She was, of course, the campaign director of Waking the Feminists, a grassroots campaign for equality for women in Irish theatre that began in response to the announcement of the Waking the Nation centenary celebratory programme at the theatre, and a number of articles, of course, have been written about that moment and that campaign. In case you don't know, that campaign ran from 2015 to 16, and the outcomes of those dialogues and the outcome and what those dialogues provoked are something that I think would be interesting to come back to for both our panelists today. However, Lian's work also encompasses a lot of other things, scenography in particular, with designs for Moonfit Halls in 2019, Annie Ryan's adaptation of A Girl is a Half-Formed Thing, which was on in the Dublin Theatre Festival in 2014, as well as work with Pan Theatre, Broken Talkers, Junk Ensemble, and Louise White, among others. Lian, of course, was also the Dublin Fringe Festival Programme Manager from 2009 to 2011, and the Exhibition Coordinator for Ireland's contribution to the Prague Quadrennial in 2007. Maeve Stone is a director and writer for film and theatre, and is also an activist concerned with climate and feminism, and is connected, of course, with Waking the Feminists too, which we'll talk about. She's project leader for Access Ballymun's pop-up green arts department and a Platform 13 artist focusing on climate and biodiversity in County Clare. Most recently, Maeve was the embedded artist for a European cultural adaptation project with Codema, the energy agency in Dublin, and Access Ballymun that considered the role of artists in climate adaptation, and was a resident assistant director at the Abbey in 2012, and the first associate director with Pan Theatre Company. Maeve's first short film, The House Fell, premiered at the Cork Film Festival in 2019. Her theatre work is interdisciplinary and experimental, including a piece called Bodies of Water with Owen Carrick and Jonah King, 2019. On Woman Part 3 with feminist theatre company The Rabble from 2018, and many other works that you can see on her website. So Lian and Maeve, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And I thought we'd just begin in the predictable place, asking both of you a little bit more about the background of your careers and the kind of catalysts to your work in arts, and also how you know each other. So maybe I'll start with Lian and move to Maeve, and then swap around in the next questions. Over to you.
Sure, thanks, Claire. I suppose I've been working in theatre for a very long time, really. I got involved in youth theatre when I was a teenager in Dublin, and I've kind of never stopped since. My connection with Pan Theatre, which is how I think originally myself and Maeve really got to know each other, started when I was 18, and I volunteered for the Dublin International Theatre Symposium, which was a kind of a festival, an international festival that Pan ran for a number of years. And I feel like over the years, in some ways, I identify myself less and less with theatre. However, I get identified in some ways more and more, particularly because of Waking the Feminists, with theatre. But I do tend to work with lots of different types of arts organisations, not just theatre organisations. And in the last number of years, trying to sort of work out what my own work is as an artist on my own, which is a big question at the moment, certainly in my mind. But yeah, I've I suppose ended up in a kind of a dual career where I'm a designer and I'm also a project manager for different kinds of cultural events. And in terms of the project management side of things, I'm usually interested in things that have either some aspect of international artists meeting Irish artists, or artist support and management, or support and development, or sometimes sort of community, I suppose, based arts. That they tend to be my sort of areas of focus. So in the last number of years, I've run the Pan International Mentorship Programme, a programme called Gap Days, which I run with Mermaid Arts Centre, which is about giving sort of micro residencies really to independent freelance theatre artists. And yes, in normal times, I would normally be designing 2 to 3 shows of usually contemporary devised work, often not in theatre spaces. I would be doing 2 or 3 shows a year. Of course, and we'll come to this later maybe, but my everything has changed in the last year and a half. But yes, Maeve and I know each other a good long time. Like, I don't even know how long it is.
Oh, don't put a number on it.
Okay,
good. Reveal too much. Shall I take the con?
Go for it.
Okay. Lian's done a great job of sort of the foundations of how we sort of got to know each other originally. I also had the gateway drug of youth theatre as my introduction to theatre, and I think it's interesting when you talk to people, because I think it's the first time where, as a young person, you're really introduced into a community of creativity, and I think that's really appealing at that age and can do long-standing damage in terms of steering you away from a solid income and security in your life. But very grateful to it as well, for leaving me with such amazing people and interesting things to be doing with my time. So out of college, I studied in Trinity, and when I finished, I was really interested in making work with a small group of writers, and so focused a lot on new writing. And like Lian was working at the time, it was 2009, the city had stopped. The global economic crash had emptied so many buildings around Dublin that you could get into places, and you could spend time and you could make a world. I was really, really lucky in terms of being a really rich time for artists, and I'm crossing my fingers that the crisis that we're kind of heading into out of the one that we're in currently is going to maybe foster the same kind of fertility in creative circles as it once did. So yes, kind of was very lucky in that way, and cut my teeth learning all of the mistakes firsthand, and then at that point realized that the work that I was most interested in was more experimental, and had the opportunity to assist Pan, Gavin Quinn and Aideen on a couple of projects, and just kind of learned by watching very quickly. And it was an odd time as well, because I was simultaneously assistant director at the Abbey, which is obviously the National Theatre. So I had this very bizarre cocktail of the most experimental international work happening in Ireland with the most, what some people would see as conservative or canonical work happening in the country. And that year in particular, both companies produced a version of King Lear. So by the end of that year, I knew everything there was to know about King Lear and all of the ways you could approach it. So that sort of gave me a bit of time to grow creatively as well, led me to a point of kind of questioning what was the work that I wanted to be making, and was really curious about the same kind of multidisciplinary approaches that Lian is describing, where you have multiple sources of curiosity, I suppose, feeding your process. And one of the things that became really central to my work at that stage was the idea of bringing people from different forms and different backgrounds together, because of the language that it required and because of the language it creates. Because if you've got people coming from really diverse contexts with really differing frames of reference, you have to seek out the common language. It's like a really complicated Venn diagram, but the center of that Venn diagram is so beautiful if you can find it. So I think that kind of really spurred me on towards more interdisciplinary, more experimental work. And I guess around that time, Waking the Feminists happened and was a booster shot in terms of political action and political voice, not just for me, but I think the entire industry. And that's another catalyst maybe that impacted on the kind of work that I was making and the kinds of people that I was seeking out to make work with. So it was the same year that I co-founded Change of Address, which is a collective that ran for 5 years. And the kind of agenda underneath it was to connect artists and asylum seekers in a diverse range of projects. I don't think we ever did anything twice. I think over the 5 years, I don't think there was a single project that even could be mistaken for another project. They were all completely different and very sort of fast learning with that as well. So yeah, I think my work has kind of taken a strange path through discovery of creative and imaginative and storytelling ideas and ideals, and then more into political and macro themes and the kinds of, the way that we make work being as much of a source of power and pleasure as the kind of work that ends up being on stage for people. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there because I'm prone to waffling. So.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing is sort of forms of collaboration and process being of key importance to you. Okay, let's go back to the obvious place, which is Waking the Feminists. This is where I think from an academic side, people at least hear of you and sort of see or hear something of what you were doing. So how would you describe the outcomes of that campaign, that experience? Now, Maeve has already started with how that involvement might have changed what you do. Lian, maybe that's something that we could come to you. I'm kind of interested in what comes out of that as the sort of after effect, what kind of shift, or if there is a shift, that you would say either personally or more generally
I mean, it's really hard to encapsulate because there was enormous shifts of all kinds, not like personally for certain and within Irish theatre for certain. I mean, it's really, I won't go into too much detail, but everything from all of a sudden, all of our major funded theatre organisations in the country, plus all of the national cultural institutions around the country, suddenly having gender policies, which they never had before, because all of a sudden we were going, hang on a second, you don't have one? Why don't you have one? And realising that this was actually something that they were way behind on. So from a kind of a policy level, that understanding, or at least maybe I'm too hopeful in saying an understanding, but at least an awareness that this is something that needs to be addressed. But on a very day-to-day level, I think it's not an understatement, I think, to say that it changed pretty much everybody in Irish theatre, because before Waking the Feminists, sort of, I look back and I think why were we so nervous about talking about these things? But we really were, and there was a real fear, which I could feel at the start of Waking the Feminists, which was literally started by me and a few other people starting to write things on social media, and more and more and more people adding their voices, more and more women talking about their experiences in the Abbey, and then not just in the Abbey, in theatre across Ireland. And there was a real sense of danger around that. There was a real sense of like, ooh, are you sure you really want to say that publicly? And now when I look back at what people were saying, which I remember vividly at the time thinking was dangerous, I now look at it and go, oh, is that all they said? You know, so the sense of what's allowed to be talked about in the workplace has completely shifted. And obviously now the conversation, I'm delighted to say, is spreading out more than just feminism, because we're talking a lot more about intersectional feminism, about the fact that Irish theatre is still predominantly, very, very, very predominantly white, sadly probably increasingly middle class, you know, that we don't hear a lot of voices from the margins. So when something like, for example, Walls and Windows, which just was on in the Abbey in the last few weeks, which was, you know, a story written by a traveller woman about a traveller family. And I sat there and I watched it and I thought, I have never seen this before. You know, I have never seen this story told from this point of view. And I just thought that was extraordinary. So all of these things, I think, can be traced back in some way to Waking the Feminists. From a personal point of view, I mean, it absolutely, you know, pre-Waking the Feminists, I was not an activist. I hadn't really spoken publicly. I was very much a behind the scenes kind of a person. It wasn't a choice. I didn't set out to go, right, let's create this campaign and make some big changes. It kind of happened, and there was a group of us who went, right, we have to take this momentum and use it, because otherwise it'll be a waste. And I was, you know, I'm very glad I did it. I'm not, you know, that's not, it's not a problem in any way. There's a lot of things I learned, and I'm very grateful for that. But it did shift not just my sense of who I am, but definitely how other people see me. You know, for a long time then it was like, oh, you're a leader. What are you going to do next? Like, what are you going to lead next? And I was kind of going, am I? Oh my God, you know, do I have to lead something? What do I want to lead? And then realize, you know, it took a long time to just go, oh no, I don't have to. That wasn't something I signed up to. And I'm, you know, like I said, I'm glad I did it, but I'm quite happy to just continue my path as an artist. But it was, yeah, it was a big shift that whole year, because the campaign itself was only a year long, but I suppose there are echoes of it that keep going on, and not just in theatre. It sort of spreads out from theatre into particularly other creative communities in Ireland. So yeah, I really can't understate the hugeness of the change. Yeah.
Okay.
I've gone grayer as well, just so you can all see. Wow. You can compare and contrast from the last 5 years ago.
I know it's a cliche, but it's never felt truer than with you, Lian, that like the best leaders are the people who don't want to be them. You know, they're the people that aren't choosing that for themselves, but who are the perfect person to perform that role at that time. And I know I am incredibly grateful to you, and I'm not alone in that. I think there's an awful lot of people who are very grateful to you, and particularly grateful that it was you as well, for a multitude of reasons, but one of them being that there was a care in how the conversation was conducted, particularly in the early days when it was held on platforms that we are incredibly shouty as a species on. And it's one of the few times I've actually seen those platforms used in a way that was holding space in a very caring and positive way around a subject that was a critical subject, particularly of an institution. And I think it set the tone for Waking the Feminists. It gave the movement an identity that we were all very proud of. And there was, because often with political movements or these moments of political shifts where the paradigm changes, there can be a lot of confusion over what the message or idea actually includes. Like there can be multiplicity in the ideas that make it confusing or difficult for a person to say wholeheartedly, yes, I'm behind this, I believe in this represents exactly how I feel. But I think that Lian and the sort of the core group of people that were working from the very beginning were just incredibly well positioned and had incredible skill in directing the conversation in such a positive way. And I think when you ask the question of what are the kind of contemporary resonances out of that, I think there, like Lian says, there's no way of measuring it, because I think when it has that organically positive origin story, the way that it grows are equally positive. And I think that means that more of the idea spreads out because it's easier, because it's a positive message that people can sort of get behind and endorse. And there was, a philosophy or an idea underneath Waking the Feminists from the very beginning, and I don't know whose idea it was, but I suspect it might have been yours, which was that if you wanted to be part of Waking the Feminists, you were. And if you wanted to host a Waking the Feminists event, you just did. And so there was no centralized messaging. There was no governance of what the conversation should be, which democratized it completely. And it gave people ownership over the idea that things were changing. And that meant that things did change at a very personal level, which have just continued to grow out into the ecosystem. And for me personally, I mean, it's not a coincidence that Waking the Feminists is the same year that Change of Address was created. And it was myself and two other women who started that. And I think one of the things that the moment offered was conversation between women, which seeded all of these projects, which, if you could map them, would be the most beautiful map you've ever seen. And a very direct thing that I feel confident in saying, though I have no empirical evidence to support myself, is that the seeds that sowed amongst women and amongst people around political action absolutely fed the repeal campaign, which was gathering momentum at that time. And I think that the two, for me, are inextricably linked, because I would not have had the confidence that I had to step into that political conversation and to show up for what I believed in the same way if I hadn't already had this incredibly connecting experience through Waking the Feminists.
Absolutely. I think there was a very clear series of big social movements and big social events that kind of, I wouldn't say ran into the next, but the energy moved from one to the other. And it was marriage equality, followed by Waking the Feminists. I mean, there was other stuff in there as well, but I suppose big things from my point of view were marriage equality, Waking the Feminists, following into Me Too as it happened in Ireland, and particularly in theatre, with Grace Dias, who's a young theatre director, who basically outed the person who had run the gate for the previous 33 years, and very publicly talked about his behaviour towards her and started a whole ball rolling with that. And I know she has said she wouldn't have been able to do that without Waking the Feminists. And then that, led on, and I think the following year, into the repeal campaign. And I do think there's a little bit, I think it's still going. I think there's a feeling now in Ireland, I mean, this is slightly off the point, but it's just interesting seeing that thread in terms of huge social change in Ireland in a very short period of time. I do think the thing now, certainly in the circles that I'm aware of, there was a feeling after repeal of like, okay, we've done all these big things, what's next? Like looking out for like the next big thing to put our energy into. And I do think now it's probably housing. In the next, hopefully once things start to open it up again, it's the thing that people are talking about in that kind of, it's almost getting onto its feet and actually being active. So I'm hopeful that that'll be the next little social revolution in Ireland.
Maybe connected to that as well, and a very direct response to the wave of female voices in political spaces, if you want to put it that way, is gender representation in politics, that there's been a huge shift in that as well. And I'm thinking specifically, or the person who made me think it was Sarah Durkin, who was directly involved in the Waking the Feminists campaign, and who's now kind of one of our leading female politicians, I would say, or is kind of one of the ones I would have the most hope for in terms of tackling some of those big social issues like housing and like climate as well coming down the road.
Yeah. And people like Ivana Bakic,
absolutely, who was on the stage at Waking the, I'm delighted, she was the kind of compere for the Waking the Feminists event when she was still a senator. She's obviously been an incredible thread through so much social change and push and like work for social change that's been happening over decades. So yeah, I'm delighted that she's now in the Dáil.
Yes. Yes, these changes are so big. It's hard to grab hold of them, I think, and grasp them properly. And I think that when you're not, kind of in Ireland all the time, and you see the sort of after effects of those debates and discussions happening in the work that you might encounter in the Abbey, it's quite striking. And the kinds of shows that have gone on, from Deirdre Kinahan's work and Walls and Windows, as you said, but also that incredible performance Home, which was broadcast during lockdown. And it seems like there's a whole sequence of work in those places that you might see from a distance that begin to unpack what's happened there. And I was thinking, as you're describing how Waking the Feminists had a sort of generous critical space at the start. It was very much on my mind that the next stage is what happened at the Gate Theatre. That point of criticism becomes much sharper in those conflicts.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about what you've been doing since. Quite obviously, I think both of you work in very non-singular ways. It's very much about collaborating with others and making these networks. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about how that defines or kind of complicates your way of being an artist. I think I sense this with Lian, especially when you have two hats, a management and an artistic one. And you yourself brought up this point about what's center and what's periphery, or what's home and what's outside of that or beyond. So maybe can we start with Maeve, and you could describe some of your work to us. I know that you sent me a file, so I don't know whether you wanted to, or is that for later?
No, I mean, if now is the work chat, then I'm happy to. I'll just
let's go for the work chat.
Okay, so I'm just going to do a sort of a speedy trip through some of the highlights from my career over the last decade or so. So this was a site-specific piece, which was a seed of an idea that grew in commission that I got from the City of Culture, which was Limerick in 2014. And they had brought an Australian organisation called Chambermaid Opera on board. And there was an open call, which I was really excited to be chosen for, because it meant collaborating with this experimental opera company in Melbourne and devising a piece that actually ended up being an opera with no singing. We chose to work with dance artist Catherine O'Malley, who's in this picture here. And it was a piece that sort of focused on the nature of grief and grieving and the wake ritual in Irish tradition. And I think it sort of is something that I guess if I look sort of at a zoomed out level at my work generally, it does tend to speak to or from the things that we can learn through grief and through loss. And I think this was one of the first echoes of dealing with the climate crisis. This specific piece was looking at the idea of flood events in the city and was sort of made personal through the idea of the loss of the mother. And so it was a really special piece to work on. That's probably enough to say about that. The Shitstorm was another kind of amazing, very different experience. This is kind of the only piece of straight theatre I think you'll see in this list. And it was a co-commission by the Abbey and Dublin Fringe. It was my homage to The Tempest and to the character of Miranda. I wanted to, on the back of Waking the Feminists, sort of deep dive into the canon with a feminist lens. And I set on Shakespeare's last play, or the one that we know that he was definitely involved in writing last. And I wanted to explore the female characters in that in a different way, because Miranda as a character is incredibly controlled and quite contrived as a result. And so the origin point for me was thinking about, you know, if there were a sequel to The Tempest and Miranda and her father were just on this island together, and she's a teenage girl, right? So what happens? And if she's got more autonomy, more voice, what does it sound like? And that kind of led very organically towards the Riot Girl movement, towards punk music, towards the sort of the origins of protest female voices in public spaces, spot the connection, and ended up being a collaborative project with Simon Doyle as a writer, which Simon, I don't know if you know, wrote a couple of pieces which Pan have made, including Oedipus Loves You, which was a really influential piece in my early theatre life. So that was quite an experience. Mouth of a Shark is the first sort of performance outcome from the change of address work that we'd been doing at this point for 3 years. And it was a commission from This Is Pop Baby for their Where We Live festival. It took us 3 years to feel confident that we had earned a place as people, you know, who had built friendships, I suppose, within the community, so that beginning to collaborate professionally and creatively wasn't a nervous territory for us anymore. It didn't feel like it would lead us in the wrong direction towards work that could be exploitative or damaging or negative in any way for the people that we were working with. It took us a long time to get there, and I think it was a beautiful piece to work on. It was specifically about LGBT experience. So it was verbatim interviews with Irish people who left Ireland in the 70s, 80s and 90s because it wasn't safe to be gay. and then equally matched by narratives of people arriving in Ireland today because it's not safe to be gay where they're coming from. So we were working with extraordinary people, and it was my first experience of trying to cast in a really diverse way in Ireland. And my God, it was not easy. It was really, really challenging, actually. And it made me realize that the skills that I've been developing in thinking about art in a non-linear way were actually incredibly useful and important when it came to challenging the method and the approaches and the processes that we were using in the day-to-day. So, for example, if we do want to cast a show with, 4 people that aren't white and Irish, we need to think in a different way. And I think that's something that became really important and positive, I suppose, with that work. Woman was a collaboration with another company from Melbourne called The Rabble, another resonance on from Waking the Feminists. The Rabble are a radical feminist theatre company who make extraordinary work. And this was a piece that we presented at the Fringe, was commissioned by the Fringe Festival in Dublin, starring Alwyn Fuere in 2019. It had its premiere in Melbourne with an Australian cast, and the ironic thing with this project was that we got funded by the Australian Arts Council to produce it in Dublin, and we did not get funded by the Irish Arts Council. And keeping in mind, it was presented in Dublin in 2018, the year of the referendum for abortion rights. The piece was about bodily autonomy and pregnancy as an experience. So it was quite eye-opening to sort of have that experience of support from afar, but not locally. And I'm really grateful, I suppose, for the opportunity to make those connections abroad. And it feels like something that would be almost impossible to do now, right now, obviously, but even into the future, kind of difficult to imagine being able to work in Melbourne for months on end with an amazing company like that. And this is the last known live work that I presented before the world stopped working. This is Bodies of Water, and it was a collaboration with Jonah King, who's a visual artist based in New York, and Owen Carrick, who's another director, and Una Kavanagh, who's an incredible performance artist, actor, and actual visual artist herself. And it was a piece, again, taking grief as a sort of a central structure or scaffold, and looking at the climate crisis at a personal level via this sort of character who is mourning the loss of a lover from years back. And it was based loosely on the life of Bastian Adder. If you know his work, he was an artist who disappeared at sea as he attempted to cross from America to Europe, and his widow was left in charge of his estate, and that became her job. And I became fascinated with that and the relationship between the person left behind and the work, and the world's relationship to that work. So it's it's a piece that sort of took the idea of the North Atlantic gyre, which is just filled with our rubbish and spins constantly, as a central image, and then built the story of this woman's grief around that image. I'm conscious now I've taken up way too much time, so I'll stop sharing. Apologies. That was too many photos, and
it's a pleasure to see them. Lian.
Sure. I'll talk to you about 3. I sort of picked out 3 different. So it's not a brag, but if anybody ever asks me what do you do for a living, I have this internal oh God, because I think I could literally talk about that for an hour, just tell them what I did for a living. And there's so many different types of work that I've done over the years in different directions. So I've taken 3 pieces of work just to show you 3 very different things that I've worked on over the years, but you might see connections between them. So I will share my screen quickly. Sorry, and I will basically just show you my website, which means that you can always go back and see more. Hopefully this works. So can you see that?
Yes.
Website, great. So lianbell.com, very easy. And as you can see, I sort of split it into 3 simple headlines: set design, artwork, and arts management, which is kind of the easiest way to describe it. if you go into set design, you'll see there's all the different projects I've worked on over the years. I've taken a few, let me see, what order will I do this in? Firstly, yeah, so Foil Punt is a show that I worked on about 3 years ago or so with a company called The Local Group, which was was a kind of a very short-lived group of us. The person who's the producer who kind of pulled it all together is called Rasha Goen. She's now the director of Arts Admin in London. And many years ago, we met because she was the director of Dublin Fringe Festival when I was the program manager. But she got in touch with me and a few other artists, including Katrina McLaughlin, who's now co-director of the Abbey Theatre. Little John Nee, who is a musician and performer. Farah El, who is a young Irish Libyan singer-songwriter. Jenny Moran, who is a visual artist who works mostly in the area of food and hospitality, and a few other people. And we made this show, which improbably had a boat with the boat builder who made the boat in the show. And we did it in 5 different little harbours around Donegal, Derry and Sligo. So I'll just show you a handful of some of the, I'm just going to hide this, there we are. So this was Rockley Harbour in Sligo, and the performance was quite, the audience got split into different groups and got to see different things at different times. One of the spaces that they went into, obviously in each harbour, everything was different. We had to reconfigure everything each time. Myself and Katrina, the director, would come in with our plan of what the show was in the morning and look at the space and go, right, we'll do this bit there, that bit there, that bit there, that bit there. Right, okay, let's put everything up. We had no time at all. So it was all very quick. But this was one of the spaces, and what I did was create this table with tools, the outlines of tools on it, which were tools that came from the boat builder's shed. And Jenny, the artist, had a kind of a kitchen set up here. And as the boat builder described how he made an oar over here with his tools, Jenny over here was making food, which she then served to everybody on the end of the oar. And at one point, they wiped the table, and all of these tools were made out of sawdust from the floor of the boat builder's shed. So they all got wiped away. This will just give you a sense of some of that's Little John Nee and Farah singing as part of it. There you get the table in a different shed that was in Moville in Donegal. And at the end of the performance, we turned the boat into a table and served dinner around kind of fire pits to all of the audience that Jenny had made during the performance. This is Little Johnny getting rowed in at the start of the show. There is our boat builder, Philip, who is based in Greencastle, and he and his brother made this boat by hand. It's called a Foil Punt, which is the name of the show. And there's it becoming a table slowly. And I had sort of different set elements that we set up in different spaces that had to shift for each performance, of course. That's Rockley Harbour again with the boat coming in. And this is me making the stencils for those kind of the ghost tools that got wiped away from the table. That's some of the tools that I used to create the stencils. And we also got all the audience into life jackets. So the audience almost became part of the set as well. So that gives you an idea of that. So that's one of the sort of set design, site responsive, collaborative, devised pieces that I would have worked on. And those are the things that I love the best, for sure, in terms of being a designer. In terms of being a manager, this is a project that I worked on a good number of years ago between Bealtaine Festival, which is a festival for older people, creativity in older age, basically, and an organization in Birmingham called Craft Space, and the OPW, which is the organization that manages many of the historical buildings in Ireland. I won't go into too much detail. I was the coordinator of this rather than an artist on it, but I suppose I lent my artistic eye to it. We worked with a group of older people who lived near Rathfarnham Castle one year and who lived near Dublin Castle another year. And we brought in craft artists to work with them. We spent a lot of time in the buildings, looking at the architectural details of the buildings and looking at the history of the buildings, and then teaching those women and men craft skills to use some of those details and those stories to make into things. So one of the first year we worked with a paper cutting artist called Maeve and a wallpaper designer called Linda Florence. And that's one of the participants with one of her pieces. Like, they made spectacular, beautiful work. So this is just a sense of people at work. This is actually in Rathfarnham Castle. So my job was kind of getting the people involved, facilitating everything, also just helping work out how we're going to display things, what we're, I suppose responding as the project, because we didn't know what the project was at the start. We just started and then had to make it up and respond to it as time went along. So this is one of the exhibitions that we made in Rathfarnham Castle. You can see the kind of beautiful ceilings there are, and then some of the paper cut responses and print responses that came from the participants, these kinds of things, So I designed the exhibition, I suppose, was one creative aspect of it. This is Linda Florence, who uses wallpaper and pattern a lot as the basis of her design. So that gives you a sense of that. That was one other project. And then in the last few years, I suppose I've been thinking a lot more about, because I've always worked collaboratively and I really enjoy that. I'm also aware I went to Trinity College. I studied the theatre studies course, the undergrad there. Then I went to Central St. Martin's in London and I studied scenography, which was, I suppose, a course that was a lot more about making your own visually led work, usually in installation or performance, time-based work. And that was me making my own work. And I haven't done that for a very long time. So I'm still working out what that is and, where it goes. But weirdly, a few years ago, the Glucksman Gallery, which is in UCC in Cork, beautiful gallery, did a call out for artists who use photography in some way in their work, not necessarily photographers, but artists who use photography. And I pulled out this piece, which ended up being a series of 5 images. This is actually, it kind of comes from research that I was doing while I was in Central St. Martin's, so 20 years ago. And it ended up being pairs of images with text in 5 frames. And these were photographs taken when I was 21-ish in my grandparents' house, the day that the house was being cleared. So seeing all the places that I knew, all the objects, all the things that were associated with my grandparents, and knowing that they were going to be moved. And the piece is called Becoming Things Again. And I interviewed at that time, my family, different people in my family, about the objects that they remembered. At the time I was talking about my grandfather because my grandmother was still alive. And I transcribed that. And in London, I'd made a piece based on that, but this just was sort of something else that came out of it many years later. So the kind of text was, I don't know if you can read that, but I'll read a little bit of it. On the top half and the bottom half were texts from different people. He was never as involved as one would have liked, I suppose. He certainly treated me as the boy of the family, with the constant feeling of failure because I wasn't a boy. I don't know if this is the sort of stuff you want. And the two of them together were very elegant, very, very elegant and social, a very sociable pair. His evening jackets, of course, you knew from faraway places were something else. I mean, I haven't seen another human being wearing anything like that. Even the evening jackets, brocadey sort of things like that. Yeah, but rich materials too. And I mean, God, I remember them getting dressed up to go to the horse show, and I think he wore a top hat to the horse show, and he'd get all dressed up and Ma on his arm, who'd gone to Paris to buy her hats and gone to the best couturiers and gone to get her outfits made. Outfits, she'd have 2 or 3 for the week, anyway. So these were little snippets of people's memories of my grandparents, basically, who were obviously going to the horse show in top hats. So juxtaposed with those images. So that's just to give you I'll stop sharing there. It's just to give you a really fast overview of the variety of things that I end up doing, which is hard to describe and also confuses the hell out of me, and is part of my ongoing existential crisis in life. Oh, Claire, you're muted.
With existential crisis in mind, obviously everybody has been experiencing this incredible sense of suspension and halt with the pandemic. And now that is at an opening that privilege different activities in Ireland, at least for now. So GAA events can happen, but music events cannot, and so on. So thinking about that sort of period of suspension that we're hopefully coming out of, how would you describe the impact of that on your own work? Have you just been in suspension yourself, or have you something up your sleeve? Maeve, I know you were working on the cultural adaptations project, which has been distorted by that. Maybe we'll just briefly start with that.
I think the cultural adaptations project, which was a sort of a research project across 5 different cities, Dublin, Gothenburg, Ghent, and Glasgow, kind of positioned me on a new journey anyway. I was really interested in understanding where my skills and thinking could be useful within the climate conversation as it is evolving in an Irish context. So I think it was an interesting one to be set on that path in advance of this gigantic global crisis, because it had seeded all of these questions for me. And while the practical outcomes of the project, as you say, became much more adapted to an online world and maybe not as connecting and walking based as I would have liked, I think that it was also a really useful and powerful thing to be in conversation with so many people internationally about climate issues, and seeing, I guess, some of the overlap in sort of an intersectional approach to ecology and to feminism and to that, rights and access to housing, all of these things suddenly feeling like they were part of the same conversation. And I guess having this suspended moment as a time to just sort of panic because as an artist, particularly with theatre in Ireland, it's kind of it's a vulnerable species, let's put it that way. And I think that when the lockdowns happened, and ours was the first industry to close, and we were very conscious that even in those early days we would probably be the last industry to reopen, I think it forced a kind of a really, an existential crisis upon us all of can we survive this? And when we survive it, what do we want to have changed in the interim? So without being sort of naively optimistic or trying to make a beautiful thing out of a really hard time, it's been incredibly challenging. And, I also think there's an awful lot to talk about in terms of how can a person be creative when a person is afraid, when a person is anxious and living in a daily state of fear and anxiety, but also feeling like, well, the one thing I can do with myself is work. And then how do we manage that, you know, that in points of crisis and emergency, how do we access the things that make us happy as artists, which are sort of the creative tools that we have spent our lives building. And that was challenging and confronting to realize that they're one of the things that can be taken away in those moments of extremity. And then slowly coming back to feeling like there was space and time. And I don't know, I feel like there's another 2 hours worth of chat in terms of trying to figure out what just happened. Maybe I'll just hand over to Lian and she'll have some interesting things to say.
I think we talked briefly about this the other day when we were talking about today. I still feel like we're very much in a state of suspension. I think we're, you know, the rug was pulled from under everybody. I think particularly in theatre, because it just stopped around the world. Theatre stopped completely, which was quite, it shook, I think, a lot of us to our core. And I think the last, you know, like you alluded, Claire, to all this debate around when should different things open, and sport seemed to be the favoured child of the country as to that, you know, that's the most important thing to open first. I think as somebody who works in the arts for a long time, and as somebody who still struggles with calling myself an artist, actually, like saying it out loud, there's a huge struggle with self-confidence. Personally, but I think collectively we have a big struggle with self-confidence, and I think that's been exacerbated massively in the last while because people, particularly working in theatre, haven't had a chance to work in theatre. So there's going to be, as things open up again, there's going to be a lot of people not feeling confident about their skills, and I think sadly it's not just around the pandemic. I think we've been told throughout our professional careers that we're not really, like, aren't you great for doing what you love, kind of thing, but when are you going to get a real job? Which you hear, maybe not explicitly, but kind of implicitly your entire career. And I think it's almost a schizophrenic thing that Ireland has in relationship to its artists, in that we have this great calling card of Irish culture, and it's the thing, you know, that we're known for around the world. It's one of the most important sort of aspects of our internationally facing selves, while at the same time we're not nourished as artists, we're not supported as artists, and arts is seen as a little bit of a, like, it's a kind of an added luxury to life. And there was a great moment last year where I felt like, oh, look, now that everything's been pulled away from everybody, we all realize, everyone is starting to understand how important the arts are and culture is in their life, because they don't have it anymore. They can't go to gigs, they can't go to the cinema, they can't go to theatre. And then this year, to see the value of the arts so very clearly placed very far down the rungs of the ladder made me go, oh, maybe I was being a bit optimistic there, that, you know, Ireland had woken up to why the arts needs to be supported and how intrinsic it is to our lives. So while I am really hopeful, one of the things I'm hopeful for is that there's been a year and a half of so many artists sitting and thinking and pondering and developing ideas and really giving a lot more time to ideas than they would ever normally have a chance to, that when things get going again, there's going to be a sudden rush, not just in Ireland, but internationally, I think, of really interesting work. So I'm very optimistic about that. I'm also optimistic about what Maeve was saying happened post-crash, particularly in Dublin, when all of a sudden space was accessible and affordable. And that hasn't been the case in Dublin for a long time. And now, again, there's this feeling of, oh, if we suddenly get access to more space, we'll be able to do a lot more. You know, we've all been sort of working out of our bedrooms or leaving Dublin. Like Maeve is, you know, one of the artists who's left Dublin in the last number of months. So I feel like there's a lot of possibility and there's a lot of things to look forward to. But the things that I was really hoping might shift, which was this idea of the arts being actually valued at a fundamental level by our country, I'm sadly less optimistic about than I was this time last year.
Okay, thank you. I think those are interesting thoughts to sort of land on, because of course we don't know yet what is to come. And there are these enduring questions of what is valued, what seems to be valued, and then how it's valued or how it's evaluated. And that is a constant process. Andre, we are slightly over time. So I would ask you if anyone, I see Hedvig is here. Hedvig, do we have a few moments to just?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Hedvig, would you like to, yes, would you like to articulate that?
Not really. I mean, I don't have much to say, but I just wanted to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this session, because this is exactly what one hopes that theatre does, to move up, to change politics from the bottom, from this inspiration of yours, which is really the very thing we need. And as I was putting in my way too long talk here on the chat, it's what Yeats talks about in Adam's Curse. He says, we are doing what the bankers and the people in real jobs can't define. But that is what actually makes the marrow of society. And as you said, you're doing your work as community work, like Rita Duffy and so many people in Ireland, many more than in other countries, as far as I know. So thank you. That's all. So I'm gone.
You're gone. Anyone else got a comment or a question? Okay.
Maybe just, I was fascinated by the insights you gave us, and I also want to thank you for joining us here for EFACIS 2021. And you shocked me a bit there, because I could never have imagined that such fabulous artists like you are struggling with their self-confidence. But it's of course very convincing now that you explained this to us. And that's something I think you share with many in the academic community. And therefore, I just wanted to say we shouldn't. We have all good reasons, and you definitely have to be confident, and we should work towards establishing this confidence in the future. And I hope that our European corporations help, and that those different national, and I don't think they are so different, sports is the biggest thing in Germany, and I think elsewhere too also, that together we will fight this misbalance of what is deemed important in our societies. So, but basically, thanks again for a wonderful last session for this conference.
Thanks, Katharina. I was just going to say, in response to that, a conversation that we had with Claire a couple of days ago kind of touched on this. I think I don't know academia obviously as well as I know the arts community, but I think academia and the arts both struggle with being defined within a capitalist society, that our systems are what we stand for and what we value and what we do for society is being constrained into a capitalist system that doesn't actually value the intangible. It's always looking for, how do we report on things, how do we assess things, and I think unfortunately it's I think that might be part of the aspect of lack of self-confidence when you're told over and over again that what you do doesn't really have value, because underlying that it's not making money, you know, which is the main point, obviously, of it's not making profit for anybody, so therefore it's not valuable. I think that underlies a lot of the reasons why maybe there's a confidence crisis. And I would say in the arts there is a confidence crisis. We're maybe very good at hiding it because we've done it for so long, but there definitely is.
It's it brings to mind as well, there's an amazing civic practice artist called Frances Whitehead, who's an American artist, and she spoke at a conference that I was involved in. She said that it's hard to deal scientifically with feelings. And I think that there's something of that in what we're describing here, where there's a sort of an empirical value system, a hierarchical empirical value system that is prescribed by capitalist structures that don't make space for human beings having feelings, and doubt and fear and all of those things that make us human, and that actually are the fabric of what connects us to one another as well. And, you know, that's often the subjects that we gain the most from when we can experience them through art. They're the most cathartic things that we can experience. So I think it stuck with me because it seems to sum up so much.
James, I see you raised a hand.
Thanks, Claire, and thanks so much, Lian and Maeve, for a really interesting panel. We're really honoured to have you at the conference. I was interested to hear the topic of housing come up so many times in both your talks, and it's obviously something that's, you know, the central political issue in Irish society at the moment, and something that theatre practitioners and artists working with space are really well equipped to kind of to feel, to go back to Maeve's idea of an art of emotions. I know this might be an impossible question to answer, but I was wondering if you see the kinds of availabilities for space opening up in a way that they did after the crash in 08-09. Is that possible to kind of sense yet, or is it still something that you have to kind of wait and see what happens? I'd be interested to know any of your thoughts on this.
I think certainly in Dublin, I think it's still early days because we don't even know yet. Like literally, I don't know if it's the same in wherever you guys are, but we've been walking down streets where all the shutters have been pulled down for months and months and months, and we're at a point where some of those shutters are coming up, but not all of them, and we don't know yet. Are they not going up because the business is closed, or because the person is still not confident about being, you know, exposed to other people, or are there other reasons behind it? So we just don't know yet. It's kind of like waiting to see what the city is going to look like again. So that's one reason I think that we don't know yet. Another one is I feel like, again, as we kind of emerge from our layers and come out into the light and look around, I'm slightly terrified that we're going to emerge and look around and realize lots of people have disappeared. Lots of artists have left the arts because they needed to make money elsewhere. Not just the artists as well. I think, you know, technicians, production managers, the people who actually kind of make things happen, but very much behind the scenes, a lot of those will have had to find other jobs. And a lot of them will have left Dublin. And how that changes, I think that's a really interesting change in Ireland, is the spreading of people into the countryside, and whether that's long term or not. And what that does to how we work together, and where art is available, because it's been very concentrated on the capital city and on cities. So where art is available around the country, I'm hopeful again will change. But Maeve is kind of the expert on this because she's one of the people who has left the capital.
Yeah, it was odd timing. I left 2 months before the pandemic, and it was on the back of thinking about future emergencies and really questioning what I wanted for my life in the event of an emergency. I want to be not in a city, I want to be near my family, and I want to be really connected and embedded in a strong community that I can add value to. So that was kind of the thinking behind our move out west. But it's been really interesting because, like, with the crash in 08-09, the rent prices weren't crazy. So you could live in Dublin and it wasn't going to cost you an arm and a leg. At the moment, like, the rent that I left in Dublin was like, my own rent, well, for the whole house was like 1,600 for a 2-bed. I'm now renting a 4-bed in County Clare for €900, and I share that with another person. So, like, the difference of the quality of life and the space it affords you is quite something. And what I would say, I would hope is going to happen, though it's, again, like you say, it's all speculative currently, because there's a question around working from home and how that's going to impact on the multinationals that are based in the city, because they are one of the catalysts for insane rental prices that have swept Dublin. So if there is no return to work situation for the likes of Google, Twitter, Airbnb, you know, the big multinationals that are importing an awful lot of their employees and then paying them, you know, sort of excesses in order to keep them in Dublin, those are the people that could afford $3,000 a month for a 2-bed in the city somewhere. So I'm hopeful that if that ecosystem stays permanently changed, that it might also have a knock-on effect to the cost of renting, because that's where artists are impacted immediately and directly in this situation. And the bonus, I suppose, isn't, you know, the small businesses closing. Like, I really hope all of those shutters go up and they open up again. It's the big chains, it's the large outlets that are, you know, those are the spaces that become really interesting playgrounds for artists in a city in a kind of an economic crash. So the fingers are firmly crossed. There's things to be hopeful about, but we'll have to see what ends up, how the chips lie.
Yeah. The other big thing that I think, or the thing that has the potential to be big, is the announcement that happened last year or earlier this year of a test run of universal basic income using the arts as the testing ground. We don't know yet what that means. We don't know yet how big that will be as a test case. But the idea that there will be potentially, for some people working in the artists and arts workers, that there will be some people supported with a small amount of money regularly to then just go and do whatever they want to do and keep doing their work, but have a bit of stability. That anyone you talk to who works in the arts, you can see their eyes just starting to like glisten when you mention it, because everyone's just been thinking, oh my God, if I got that, it would change my life. You know, really, an artist who I know who recently got onto Éisteanna, which is the Irish Arts Council, a sort of a part of the Arts Council where you are elected to it by your peers and you then get a stipend. It's kind of a recognition of you as a major contributing artist to Irish culture. For the rest of your life, you get a small stipend of, I think it's €17,000 a year, which in Ireland is not a lot, but as an artist is a lot. And a friend of mine who got recently elected to it said to me how extraordinary it was. She said, she's a writer, and she said, I feel like I realized the piece of brain that worries about money is also the same piece of brain that I write with. So they've been in conflict that whole time. And now that this money has just come and is there for the rest of her life, she just has this incredible space to be creative. So that's, I suppose, you know, we're all crossing our fingers that that's actually going to happen, and that universal basic income test will happen in the arts and will then stay, would be life-changing. Yeah.
If housing is of interest as a subject for you,
revolutionary.
Yeah, I'd recommend checking out. I've just popped it into the chat. There's a group called Self-Organized Architecture that have been working for the last 5 years on alternative housing. And one of the co-housing groups that has emerged is a collective of artists in Dublin City, including singer-songwriter Loa. which I was not expecting when I went to their last conference, and there she was on the screen. But yeah, so they have a co-housing group that started in Dublin City, so that might be interesting if it's a subject that you're curious about.
Which coincidentally, I organised their major conference about 2 or 3 years ago. Yeah.
No.
So there you go. It's all connected.
All right.
Thanks so much. I'll
Okay.
definitely check that
They're
out. And your
great.
thoughts are really interesting on the whole topic.
All right. So I think, given the time, we should wrap it up. I'd just like to thank Lian and Maeve again for a very stimulating sharing of experience and ideas. Much appreciated, as we've heard. Thank you again.